Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Better Satellite World, the podcast of Space and Satellite Professionals International. I'm Lou Zaccarella. This podcast is brought to you through the generous support of EchoStar Hughes and Access Intelligence. Additional support comes from the 3,000 members of Space and Satellite Professionals International and our international chapters. Thank you. The special six-part series of Risk is sponsored by Kymeta, OneWeb Satellites, and Mansat. Well, today we conclude this series with episode 6, and we thought we'd save the big issue for last. And so we've given this episode two working titles: India Rising and The Risk of Doing Business in India. Now, the two may not be mutually exclusive. The space and satellite industry, as well as the talent base and innovation levels, have been rising as fast in India as anywhere. India is obviously poised to become a major player in the international commercial industry. Or is it? India and ISRO are still thought of as closed shops in many circles, while a new generation of analysts, entrepreneurs, and international investors are absolutely bullish on the nation's potential to rise in commercial space. Well, at the Better Satellite World, we have the privilege of being able to ask people who know what's going on inside India what's going on. And so we're going to ask what's next. And I've invited three people who will give us a deep dive into India. Gagan Agrawal has worked across most every discipline in the industry, from product development to launch system engineering to finance. Prior to that, he served in key roles at SES and ISRO. Mr. Agrawal was recently the senior analyst and SATCOM finance practice lead at prestigious NSR. An entrepreneur, he co-founded EDRI, and he is a busy man. We welcome him here today. Saurabh Bhattacharya is the senior director at PwC Advisory in Bangalore. He leads a team within the government and public sector practice dedicated to the space sector. Saurabh oversees strategies, socioeconomic impacts, governance, and data analytics projects across the industry's many layers. Of note, he has advised the Indian Space Research Organization, or ISRO. Jay Gullish is the Senior Director of the Digital Economy, Media, Entertainment, and SATCOM area for the U.S.-India Business Council. For those of you unfamiliar with the council, it was formed back in 1975 at the request of the U.S. and Indian governments. It has emerged as the leading business advocacy organization for these two spacefaring nations. Jay has passionately promoted digital development across the globe in many sectors, including satellite communications, where he has an obvious passion, as I think you'll learn. Jay served as a digital policy officer at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, and we are proud to claim him as one of the founders of SSPI's India chapter. Gentlemen, welcome to the Better Satellite World.
Thank you, Lou. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Well, it's great to hear all your voices, and thank you for staying up late for us in India. I'm going to ask the general question first. Gagan, I'm going to start with you. What is the current state of the commercial space and satellite industry in India as it relates to our subject today, opening the Indian space and satellite market?
Thanks, Lou. So we've seen some of the very recent happenings in the last 2 years or so. We've seen 4 startups get funding, right from Earth observation to launching to manufacturing systems for satellites. And we've also seen ISRO, in partnership with the Telecom and Government of India, put out a much more forward policy where they want to engage with the startups and the established companies and move out the productionization of launch vehicles and satellites out. So with these two areas have been particularly promising. As it relates, is there any revenue today? Not really with respect to the new segments, but the old segment of SATCOM still goes on the downstream, where you lease bandwidth via ISRO. For KU band, C band is direct, and for applications such as DTH and VSAT. With that in mind, we see both SATCOM with arrival of players in constellations and new ones via ISRO's new policy, as well as in Earth observation and downstream data analytics to grow further, almost, I would say, as much as 10x in the next 5 years.
Very good. Well, Saurabh, that sounds to me like an industry rising. Is there concurrence at PwC? Are you seeing that as well, or are there significant obstacles?
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with Gagan that there's a great possibilities which we see right now. Just to put some figures to this entire conversation, Indian space industry today is approximately $9 billion, but primarily dominated by the expenditure which is done by the government. What we see right now is that upstream and downstream both businesses are growing. Upstream at a pace of around 14% and downstream approximately around 30%. While we don't see any major challenges in downstream because it's quite the barrier to entry regulations are quite convenient. What we see right now as a barrier in the upstream is primarily funding. Most of these growth is driven through either the government expenditure, which is what I would say is not something which will at a certain point allow the system to grow to a larger extent, to a great extent. So you need private players to come in. But at this stage, this entire growth is driven by the startups. You have approximately 50 to 120 startups. Not all of them are in the upstream business. Maybe around 5 or 10 of them are in the upstream business. But the amount of funding they have is quite minimal. Any such upstream business requires at least $10 million at least to start its business. But the type of funding which is coming from internal sources or internal VC ecosystem is quite meager, and we in fact had a couple of conversation with them. So they don't want to they think there's a lot of risk in this, they don't want to put their hand into this. So this is one area where we feel that a lot of investment is required. Maybe foreign investments are required, FDIs are required. We do have seen some investments coming in, like in 2021 there was a significant investment of around 7.3 million US dollars, which we saw one company getting that, a startup getting that around March 2021. That's encouraging, but we need to have more such investments coming in. That's the way I look at it.
Very good. Jay, over to you. I'm going to ask you for the same question, the current state, but also because you've been looking at this for a long, long time, and you've got sort of a unique perch with the U.S.-India Business Council. What role can the U.S.-India Business Council play in enabling the market to rise in India, given the United States sort of advanced position with regard to investment and the types of things that Gagan and Saurabh were saying is needed?
Wonderful. Well, let me start again by thanking you and Gagan and Saurabh for letting me participate in this conversation. It's always nice and pleasurable to talk with old friends about an area of passion and opportunity. I would characterize the Indian commercial space sector, broadly speaking, as one that's both underutilized, but also could generate tremendous opportunities. If you take the number that Saurabh mentioned, around $9 billion, and compare that to the global space industry that's approaching $400 billion, you could do some quick math and quickly realize that the potential for India is not incremental, but it's magnitudes of growth. India, as one of the physically largest countries in the world, one of the most populous, one of the most highly digitized and digitizing nations, that's going through a major economic transformation, you could really look at satellite, whether it's government-driven, commercial, or even used by academia. The potential is there. And so how do you realize and unlock that potential? Recently, the government has been taking some baby steps to opening up its sector to try to stimulate that magnitudinal growth. However, I would encourage the government of India not to look at incremental steps, but look at opportunities that are really transformational. There's really no reason that $9 billion that Saurabh had mentioned couldn't be 50 or even $75 billion in just a handful of years. If you look at the relationship between the United States and India, I think there's also tremendous opportunities for growth, not only in the government arena, but in the commercial area. So several years ago, the U.S.-India Business Council, which is one of the leading programs within the Chamber of Commerce, started leaning forward on this area of commercial space. We're looking to do 3 or 4 really critical things. One is to identify a community of interest, not only within the business community, but academia and government and elsewhere, of people that are actually looking at this bilateral corridor, trying to understand it, trying to identify opportunities. Those opportunities could be things like joint missions, like the NISAR mission that's going to be launched next year. It could also be a variety of other opportunities, such as bringing American technology like broadband two-way internet access to ubiquitously to the government of India and throughout the geography, whether it's in the northern borders or along the coasts or via its major trading routes. And so once you have this community of interest, that's sort of this nugget that helps promote this concept. The second thing we're looking to do is really to align the 2 countries to figure out where those opportunities are. And by alignment, the United States has really been at the commercialization of its space sector probably for, 20, 30, 40 years now, depending on how far you want to go back. In the 1980s and 90s, we started looking at commercializing SATCOM and geospatial with some government supports. You had the Intelsat, privatization. And if you were to date those on a calendar, you could really see that India first now is initiating its opening of the sector probably 25 or 30 years after the United States began this. And so there's a lot of ground to catch up. And so it's not really the time and place for incremental opportunities. The last thing that I would say is we're looking forward to see how space and the sector is not just a stovepipe or a vertical, but how it really influences the whole larger transformation going on. From an India point of view, if you look at access to broadband, satellite provides a very unique opportunity. It's not intended to replace 5G or fiber optic connectivity, but it certainly could fill in a lot of gaps geographically and provide really critical redundancy in important areas. Certainly in the maritime environment along the coasts, ranging from trade to strategic issues, having SATCOM availability is really tremendous. And also, if you look at where the digital sectors are going in general, they're really data driven. A lot of that data is derived from space, but not all of it. It becomes referenced and integrated into applications ranging from things like precision farming all the way through, monitoring supply chains and things of that nature. So there's really tremendous potential across the board. So our mission here is really to promote US-India commercial trade and make sure that there is an environment of regulation and policy supporting that direction. At the same time, we're working to help the governments pull this together and talk. The United States, in terms of space diplomacy, the way our own architecture is structured, we've often struggled to engage with countries holistically. And so our efforts this year are to bring some important issues forward, as we've been doing, to develop a community of interest that includes business financiers, as well as government decision makers, and then to align and accelerate those opportunities for all of our members, and frankly, for the betterment of the citizenry in both countries.
Yeah, well said, and for the betterment of the world, better satellite world, right? Well, thank you, Jay. I think that really sets up a lot of issues that we can talk about here. Again, Jay used the word transformational at least 2 times, maybe 3, and he also was suggesting that really the time for incremental steps is probably behind us. A, do you agree with that? Is that possible? And B, what would constitute a transformational jump into the commercial sector?
Right. Thanks, Lou. And great to hear those comments from Jay. Totally agree with them. To add on to that, let's look at this segment in three sort of sectors on how each one can be transformative. Let's pick the smallest one, which is the upstream sector, satellite manufacturing and launch services. This is something where we see commercialization on not just small satellites, but also hopefully bigger satellites, both SATCOM and EO, with Indian entities putting their money in LEO constellations such as OneWeb, and with homegrown startups looking to either build subsystems of satellites or the satellites themselves. There's a good opportunity there. Next, although it's still a limited opportunity as is upstream in the entire world, which is at about $10 billion out of the $400 billion. Then we come to EO. The upstream part is getting data, relevant data in optical, radar, or hyperspectral bands. But the more important part is we've only activated only a couple of sectors downstream within agriculture, credit risk, or infrastructure monitoring. We have a whole lot of sectors in India which have not been touched, that have been touched in Europe or US, on the real estate, location intelligence, understanding commodity markets, climate change, disaster indexes, and ultimately figuring out certain investment risks because of satellite data. So this is something I see, as I said before, a 10x growth right away, given ample sectors can flourish because new data will be available, cheaper data will be available both from private entities and government entities. Secondly, for yes, go ahead.
Well, no, I'll let you finish. I wanted to ask the second part of that question, which is, how would you accelerate all of those factors, to get to 10x, maybe to 20x, because I think that's where Jay was saying it should be going, or it can be going.
Absolutely, Lou. So just before that, maybe a little bit of a light on the SATCOM part as well, given we haven't really started with IFC, internet in airplanes, or coastal monitoring, and SATCOM feedback with maritime. So all of those really pile up. Now to the question about how do we do it? Number one, the policy has to be very transparent. Sometimes in India, what happens is you have retrograde policies. Something is agreed upon and a little in the gray area, which the government then 5 years down the line stamps down, and the laws are changed. So something like that shouldn't happen in space to be able to make this happen. Second, more investment has to come in. We've seen a very recent spate of investments from 2018, 2019 as seed, and more recently in 2021 as Series A come in for the homegrown startups. So that's number one. More such investments have to come in. More risk capital has to be allotted into space, the way now we are seeing that is happening in Silicon Valley. Second, the established players of India, and there are at least 10 big aerospace and defense players in India, they should step up and say, this might be a smaller part of the business today compared to my aerospace and defense business, but it definitely has the potential to grow. Can I dip my toes in and assess that feasibility? Surely space businesses have a fairly higher risk, but I would say the returns are also fairly high, except for when you're going for consumer broadband. Policy, investment, and big players stepping in is what I would say is the start of it.
Okay. Saurabh, Jay, I'm gonna ask you to pick up on that, but I just want to go to Saurabh on this issue as well. It sounds again like we know what the landscape is. We know where the growth opportunities are. We know what kind of has to be done. We're talking now about regulatory. We're talking about making the ground for investment more fertile. Saurabh, have you seen anything within the last, say, 5 years to give you a sense that is happening and that there's sort of an irreversible course to it?
In fact, Louis, that's a very interesting question. And if I have to respond to it, I would say not in last 5 years, but in last 1 year, especially when we had the entire COVID outbreak, we saw the government working at a brisk pace to bring in policy and regulatory confirmation in the system. And one of the interesting things which happened was the formation of a regulatory ecosystem led by a body called InSpace. So you would see last year, almost around June, a year ago, when we were coming out of the COVID outbreak, the first outbreak, we saw government coming out with a series of reforms, with policies coming out, institutions getting built, and clarities coming around in multiple places. So we have InSpace, which provides a technical directorate, it has a legal directorate, safety security directorates, monitoring directorate, or the activity promotion. So they have organized it well. They have also supported it with policies. They have a SATCOM policy now, a SpaceCom policy. They have come out with a remote sensing policy. They recently came out with a navigation policy. There's interesting things have been happening. And more than that, what they also did is that they created institutional restructuring. So while ISRO used to play all the role of doing all the R&D, research and development, just like what NASA does for you, they also used to do the private industry consultations, selling their technologies or services. Now they have bifurcated that. What they have done is that has been left to do what NASA is doing right now, spend time and money on research, whereas they have formed organizations like NSIL, National Space in India Limited, which is a new body which they have formed with around $1 billion funding. The interesting part of this is that this institution will now be responsible for taking all the technology which ISRO has built and transferring it to the private sector. One
like
of the
NASA.
interesting thing which one of the interesting thing which Gagan pointed out was the risk-averse behavior of the private sector here. Private sector has not invested, except for the startups which we have seen coming up. Private sector has not invested, in fact, till today, a considerable or sizable amount, I would say, on research. They have been just one of the outsourced vendor for ISRO. But now what we see, the Godreges, the Larsen and Toubros, they are now coming out with dedicated business verticals which will spend time in receiving this technology, tying up with NSILs, receiving the technology, and then completely doing the entire development, build of the entire ecosystem and the entire assembly of the entire launch vehicle satellites. And another good thing which has happened, and I would say that's the second part of it, is that the government infrastructure has been thrown open to the private to use. So for that would mean that the ISRO's launch pads would be now available for private businesses to use. That's the second thing which has happened. So all these interestingly has happened at a time when we were going through a very bad patch in terms of economy, and which also shows that government feels that space is an instrument for creating more job opportunities, more business growth in the near future. So that's a couple of things which makes me very positive about it.
That's really interesting. Jay, do you think that scenario that Saurabh just described elevates the tolerance for risk among the private sector? And can you maybe give us some transformational reference lessons from the US as to how that would work in going forward?
Absolutely, Lou. Let me build on Saurabh's optimism. I think there's a window of opportunity here. In context, I will say that this is not the first time that this sort of optimism and window of opportunity with reference to Indian commercial space has existed.
Right.
And so getting to the core of risk, you need to have a proven period of time that will reduce that risk so that companies are thinking that this is not a one-off, that this is a more permanent restructuring. So I am optimistic. And what the government of India has done is distinctly positive. That said, the way they're looking at it, I think, is not going to be truly transformational. They're looking at a very incremental process now. Slight opening of the sector, keep it available to Indian companies primarily, localize a lot of the information and services, build up a local community of interest or a local ecosystem, a local supply chain, and then slowly open to the rest of the world. But that's not how the space industry works. The space industry already is global. The scales that make it economically viable are already international. The infrastructure inherently covers the entire Earth. So this sort of slow and steady, I don't think is going to produce the rapid gains that everybody is hoping for. And in a certain way, hives off India industry and doesn't really let India build upon its competitive benefits of just having great IT resources, having high tech and high skilled labor that can do all of this. And by being more open, it allows India to tap that global market rather than closing it off from investment and sales and ultimately generating trade friction between its larger partners. So what I would suggest is for a moment to visualize what this transformation would look like. In the United States, starting in the 1980s and sort of culminating in the 2000s, you had the government getting out of the SATCOM business, particularly looking at that segment, selling off Intelsat, which as a result generated a massive amount of investment and innovation in the commercial SATCOM market, not just in the core constellations itself, but in the downstream applications, in the creation of new constellations that focused on digital radio, on all kinds of other aviation services, the LEOs and the MEOs of the world. All that was predicated on getting the government out of building satellites and owning the networks themselves. And if you look where India is now on that one piece of the segment, they still own and operate INSAT. They are still, the government of India continues to build C-band and KU-band satellites. They are the owner, operator, and manager of India's satellite communications network. So for me, transformational would be to remove the government ownership of that, allow private sectors to run it, allow competitive constellations and satellites, and that would free up a significant amount of money, billions and billions, where the government is currently building sort of old steady state SATCOM technology and really invest going forward. If you were to toggle to perhaps the geospatial or satellite navigation realm, one of the key aspects of innovation has been free data globally. Landsat data has been available globally to everyone for many, many, many generations now, of at least technology generations. And if you look at GPS, providing that signal free to charge, free to end users, has really created an entirely new segment of space-based applications and services. And so in the Indian context right now, they're looking at making Indian data available to Indian companies only, requiring that data be held in India, and that's going to limit its ultimate value, not only to Indian companies, but to globally. And it's one of these situations where, you know, you might have some incremental growth domestically, but you're not going to create the global competitively types of companies and allowing Indian IT companies, which are already global, to sort of engage and benefit internationally, because there ultimately will be some comparability or trade frictions that are generated from that. So if we're really looking about transformation, right, there are some big ticket items the government India could do. I've mentioned one, liberalize or sell off INSAT. It could generate open skies agreements so that those Indian satellites could provide services to commercially and competitively in the region, and use Indian slots for global service too. It would really enable a lot of private sector investment that is there that currently won't look at these markets because of how they're currently structured from a domestic point of view. Meanwhile, there are these same types of investors and assets are being developed globally, but India is not part of a lot of the business plans. And so that doesn't help India, it doesn't help the global sector, and it certainly doesn't help American companies that are interested in partnering with India in this regard. Got it.
Well, Gagan, you're the pricing guy. You know how all this stuff works across the industry. Now, Jay Gullish, as he always does, has given us a master class on a lot of different things in the industry, including capitalism, by the way. It's kind of how it works. But he's also described a landscape where there are risks if you do all of those things. Of course, Intelsat today is burdened with a lot of debt. I mean, you could make a lot of cases about what happens when you take more risk. You do get more reward. that's how it works in one scenario. And as I said, to me, that's a master class. However, I want to ask you, is there something culturally that would always make India adverse to that kind of risk? I know, we spent a lot of time in Canada. They're very similar. They go slow and steady. Do you see Jay's scenario being embraced, or is there going to be a resistance to it for reasons that need to be looked at?
Right. That's a very interesting question. So
Yeah, we could have a whole show on that one, I guess. But
yeah. I think with Indian government, they have been slow traditionally because of the way we had our government. The recent government is very, very pro-business, and that's why you see space sector opening up. As Saurabh has also mentioned, this sector is looked upon as creating jobs. So if you take from the concept of creating jobs, I see the barriers to be low for both doing business and also opening up. As to the context stays, as Jay mentioned about uh, Indian government opening up the data to Indian companies and sort of having certain constraints around it. I think the JV percentage right now is around 49% for a foreign company to come in India and do business in manufacturing and EU sectors. Satcom is still developing, so I believe this is a very, very good start compared to where we were 5 years or 10 years ago. Definitely, as we go forward, given these businesses go and generate revenue that was never seen before in the commercial space, I'm fairly sure the government would be pro, given ISRO would not entirely hold all the cards. And there'll be a reason to go further from 49% to 51% or 74%.
Mm-hmm. Jay, just quickly, do you want to respond to that? Then I'm going to ask Saurabh our last question because we're going to have to wrap it pretty soon.
Yeah, there's really a cultural piece here. If you look at how the Indian community thinks of commercial space now versus the United States. In the United States, when we reference commercial space, it's really a lot of the innovative private sector driven activities, space tourism, lots of startups, lots of VCs getting into the act, sort of new things and so on. And if you look where the government of India is now, they look at commercial space as more commercial procurement of services by the government largely, without a lot of segments that will purely be in the hands of the private sector and regulated as such. So that one cultural aspect needs to be overcome. There's a second aspect of space that is still seen, and it still is, a highly strategic sector. However, around the world, there's a bit of a more dichotomy that in some segments, such as SATCOM and geospatial, it's seen as infrastructure that has a high degree of commercial and private sector activity. And of course, there still are the exquisite and other strategic assets that are utilized in terms of national defense, disaster management, and space exploration. That sort of dichotomy hasn't quite emerged from an India point of view. We're starting to see those green shoots, but not as many as we'd like. And I think there's lots of opportunities to accelerate that. I'm certainly not suggesting that the government of India get out of core space activities. What I am suggesting is that the government is currently funding and running a number of activities that one might argue at a minimum could be run and funded by the private sector at a minimum, at a maximum could generate a lot of innovation, additional avenues of investment, and then that would therefore allow the government to spend its limited resources in other areas that are more strategic and less infrastructure and commercial in nature.
Yeah, reallocate the government monies, the government investments to enable more economic growth and social activity. Saurabh, that leads me to the last question. It's a little bit of a departure from where what we've been talking about the last few minutes here. But I noticed that you work in the area of social impacts. And, I wanted to ask you, where do you see the kind of scenario that Jay and Gagan have laid out going with regard to the the industry as it grows there, broadband as the nation implements more of it, where do you see jobs, social impact, ecosystems of innovation forming? Is this something that we can expect to see more of? And obviously embrace is a good thing?
Yes, I think an interesting thing which we are seeing right now is that there's a demand. I see a market coming up, and the market is forming day by day. It has seen the way the space-based services can benefit, and there's a new horizon, the new demands which are coming up, which is creating a new market. So it's just not about looking at one or two sectors. It's not about just communication only. There's a huge demand for Earth observation, which we see. We see sectors which till today were somewhere left behind in this entire need, or the digitization's race are coming up. They need more data, be it your farming, be it your agriculture, sericulture, be it your transportation, your supply chain logistics, your infrastructure development. There's a huge demand which is coming up, and interestingly, this demand is getting propelled by some of the startups which we are seeing working in the downstream part of the business. Now, if you would see that there are around 50 to 120 startups which we saw somewhere in 2019 when we started surveying the startups. We had 50 institutions recorded with us, and today we know that there are almost around 120 figures, 120 startups which are there. They're coming out with brilliant applications, services, be it around navigation, be it around infrastructure change, the development, and most of these services depend upon the space-based data. Now that's where I see a huge amount of market getting formed. And what I would say is that while I agree with Jay to a great extent, in fact, Jay has put me in the defensive on a lighter note. But what I would say is that while we are in small scale right now, we are bringing in some reforms. But what I see, and like what Gagan spoke some time back, is that this is just a beginning. The way India has a history. India has demonstrated this. If its IT industry is today around 340 odd $1 billion, it's because of the huge reforms which were brought in. And it's a matter of 2 decades we saw things changing so phenomenally in the IT industry here. And we do expect such changes to happen at our part. We haven't seen the industry coming up. Private investments have been almost negligible. If you look at the total grants which India puts, around 0.5 percentage of its GDP spent in research and development, unlike US or China where it is almost more than 2.5% of their GDP. And out of that also investment, the type of private sector investment in research and development is almost around $5 billion, which is 10.1% of the GDP. So that's where I see things that will change with the economy opening up. With although I understand that there is a cap in the FDIs coming in, but the economy opening up with caps getting relaxed more and more, I do believe that, and obviously ISRO withdrawing itself completely to a great extent. I would say ISRO has withdrawn it from commercial operations. It still has, I agree, INSAT series running. It is still invested in space comms, but it is slowly and steadily giving it out through its subsidiaries like NSIL out to the private to manage. So maybe a few years from now, when I again join Jay in similar type of podcast, probably Jay's views would certainly undergo a change. And I do believe in a couple of years' time, you will see this piece of investment with the demand coming from the market, homegrown market, increasing, more collaborations happening, and more changes coming in. And I'll just end with two examples why I'm so excited. One is the partnerships, the investments and partnerships which I am seeing. One Airtel OneWeb partnership, we know by June 2022 we will have OneWeb services rolling out in India, which is very interesting.
Yeah.
We have also seen Berlin Space Technology partnering with an Indian firm for manufacturing 250 odd satellites. So these are the type of relationship. These are only few of the examples which I thought I should try to cite, but these are something which is giving me that excitement, and I feel that with private building up, its momentum, government will not fall short, and it will also bringing those necessary changes which Jay has been pushing for.
Yeah. Well, and you remain bullish. I can tell. So,
Absolutely. In
yes,
spite of Jay certainly being brutal but yet honest.
well, I think
Hey,
yeah,
I'm bullish. I'm
it's
bullish,
it's
but I
right.
believe that the potential is significantly larger than the incremental gains that we have here. And
Yeah.
as the space sector sort of moves to be more focused on applications, I think it's critical that the US and Indian IT sectors, which are already large, integrated, and bilateral in so many different ways, that the companies have those opportunities to promote those applications. And so I'd encourage the government to take some bolder steps to sort of enable that longer term vision rather than the steady state steps that they're taking now.
Right. Yep. You're bullish Gullish. We know that. You're enthusiastic. And it's interesting because Jay, you kind of remind me of my football coach, who's always trying to make me do better. Always make me try to achieve my potential. And it really does sound like India is beginning to go there to really achieve their potential. We're going to have another show here, and I will conclude next season's episode of Risk with this one again. So we'll come back and visit this because it's a fascinating topic, and you guys are just so great at discussing it. I really appreciate that. One thing I heard though, Saurabh, the relaxing those FDI caps, that's probably a good idea, because one of the things we see in other countries is sometimes you lose your talent. They don't have enough capital. They don't have the ecosystem to thrive. So I'm sure the government is mindful of that you want to keep your best and brightest home working, right? Thank you again for making the time to be with us today and this evening. We really appreciate it. As I said, I think this has been a fascinating discussion about a major topic and advancement for our industry. So that concludes my conversation. Gagan, Agrawal, Saurabh, Bhattacharya, and Jay
Correct.
Gullish, thank you so much for being with me.
Been great.
Thank you.
The call.
Pleasure.
For more information on PwC, visit pwc.in. And for information on the U.S.-India Business Council, go to uschamber.com. Thanks again to Kymeta, Mansat, and OneWeb Satellites who sponsored the Risk series, and you can thank them by doing business with them whenever you can. We'll be back with season 3 of Risk, but up next is our series on Space for All. We think you'll like hearing from actor Cass Anvar, star of The Expanse, and many others as they talk about how to make space accessible to everyone. The Better Satellite World podcast is brought to you by SSPI and its corporate partners, EchoStar Hughes and Access Intelligence. Learn more about the Better Satellite World series at bettersatelliteworld.com. And contact Tamara Bond Williams if you want to sponsor the next season of Risk and underwrite conversations just like the great one we had today. If you want to become a member of SSPI, the world's largest nonprofit community for space and satellite industry professionals, visit sspi.org. If you're a student, your membership is free. And follow us on Twitter at SSPI and check us out on LinkedIn and Facebook. For Space and Satellite Professionals International and our producer, Ana Gomez, I'm Lou Zaccarella. Let's make it a better satellite world, everyone. Take care.